wanted to talk with you about Phalaenopsis orchids, also known as the moth orchid. So I want to talk to you about how to take care of them and also how to get them to reflower for you. So if you're having a hard time getting your Phalaenopsis to bloom, stay tuned and we're going to talk all about it. We should begin by discussing the physiology of the orchid. So Phalaenopsis orchids are a monopodial orchid, meaning that the plant itself has one central stalk, one central main stem, which is what we're looking at here. The leaves are formed from the stem, the flower spike comes from the stem, and the roots all come from the main stem. So the vitality of the plant itself is its central core. And you can differentiate a monopodial orchid from a sympodial orchid. Like here's a really good example on one of my Oncidiums. You can see like these bulb type structures. So this would be a sympodial. So this is what we're going to focus on today, is the Phalaenopsis orchid. Phalaenopsis orchids are probably the most popular type of orchid there is. Usually it's the first kind of orchid people begin with, only because they're so easy to find. I mean, it's not always true. You could start with any other type of orchid, of course. But these guys are so commonly found. They're distributed throughout grocery stores, flower shops, orchid nurseries, garden centers. Pretty much everyone has some kind of Phalaenopsis available. So their ease of availability just makes them incredibly popular. And they're always in bloom when they're displayed, so it's really hard to pass them up when you find them. However, once people bring them home, they tend to not really understand their upkeep and how to keep these guys alive. So we're going to discuss what I do with my orchids, what works for me. I'll discuss my environment and how that might differentiate for you. And please remember, when I do my videos, that's all I do. I discuss what works for me, what I've done in the past, what I have success with. You can certainly do things differently and do what works best for you. And of course, always experiment with different things. I'll discuss what I like and what I don't like, and I'll give my explanations as to why I don't like something. But by all means, if you have the need or the desire to try something for yourself, there's no harm in it. I've done it myself. I've been there. I've experimented. So when I'm telling you something that I just don't prefer, I don't like, it is because I have tried it, and I'm just going to share my experiences with you. The first thing to really understand about these orchids is that they are epiphytic, meaning they'll grow on the surface of other plants, material, trees in the wild. They don't settle roots into the ground and grow like a normal plant. They are usually up high off the ground and collecting water and nutrients from the environment around them. Understanding how these orchids naturally grow in the wild and how they take up nutrients and water and how they best are suited to the environments that they're in will help you understand the best way to care for your orchid once you have it home. Phalaenopsis roots are very unique. They grow long to attach the orchid to different surfaces, usually tree surfaces. So they give the orchid stability while the orchid kind of like hangs off the side of the structure that it's growing onto. So they can be really, really strong. You can see they're really thick. They're covered in a layer called vellum, and the root itself is actually like a long, thin tendril that's inside of like this vellum and lots of growth all around it. So the root is well protected, and the vellum is very absorbent, and it will absorb water very easily to get down into the root inside. Without the vellum, the root is not protected and it will actually die. Phalaenopsis orchids are really good at taking care of themselves, so if they go through a lot of root damage, they will actually just go into this mode of being able to create more roots to help keep the plant alive and sustain itself. So they have really great ways of surviving. So if you tend to lose roots on your orchid, it's really not too much to fear because the roots will grow back. Healthy roots on a Phalaenopsis are like a silvery gray, greenish kind of color when they're dry. And that's actually the vellum that you're seeing. Now, if we get these wet, you'll see that they get more green with moisture. This is a really good indicator of if your Phalaenopsis is dry and getting ready to need some water. So you can see there, as they absorb more water, they become more green. Now the upper roots that are in the air are obviously going to dry out faster than any roots down here in the substrate. So I actually look at these roots. That's why I use a clear pot, and I can look at the roots down below to let me know if my orchid is actually thirsty or if it still has enough moisture down in the roots and I need to hold off watering. Dead or dying roots will be shriveled up and very dry. So there are a couple of dried roots sticking out of this phal here that I'm going to have to snip off and remove. I remove them so they don't just decay inside of the pot. Flowers are absolutely beautiful and we absolutely enjoy watching our orchids bloom. This is actually the reason we tend to buy them, is because we're so in love with the beauty they offer. So many colors and patterns come in the Phalaenopsis. And when you begin to collect them, you enjoy every single one that you can get. They're absolutely amazing. Now the flowers are usually not a very good indicator though of the health of your orchid. A lot of times people will buy them and within a couple of weeks the flowers shrivel off and fall off and people think, oh no, what did I do to my orchid? It's dying. Flowers fall off of all plants. They don't last forever. So when your orchid loses its flowers, it's just time for the orchid to be done blooming. And it has nothing to do with the health of the plant itself. So don't fret when your orchid is finished blooming and your beautiful flowers fall off. Of course we want them to last forever, but that's just not reality. The health of your plant is determined by the plant itself, just like any other plant we keep. So it's this part of the plant that you want to watch and monitor, not its flowers. A healthy Phalaenopsis orchid will have firm, well-developed green leaves. Too much light on a Phalaenopsis, too much sun, can cause lighter colored leaves, it can cause yellowing, and it can cause sunburn, which will easily happen if you give your Phalaenopsis too much direct sunlight. Especially if you're not watering it enough. Too much water loss in the leaves on top of a hot sun is usually more than a Phalaenopsis can take, and they will easily and very quickly burn. It doesn't take long at all for a Phalaenopsis to develop sunburn. So avoid putting them in direct hot sunlight at all times. Give them some bright light, but make sure it's filtered and safe from any direct exposure. Grow lights are actually a really good idea. Even a grow light, when too bright or too hot, can burn a Phalaenopsis. So do be careful even when you choose to use grow lights on your orchids. Probably the most common question that people ask about Phalaenopsis orchids is, how do I water it and how often do I water it? This can be tricky because there's really no one solid answer. There are so many variables that will determine that answer. So the size of your orchid, the size of the pot, the type of media that it's potted into, and the conditions of the environment of the room it's being kept in will all play a part in this answer. So I'm going to further explain. So there are a multitude of different kinds of media you can use to pot your Phalaenopsis into. There's bark, there's wood chips, there's sphagnum moss, there's perlite, there's clay pebbles, there's a multitude of things that people use. And whatever you use will definitely have an impact on how much you have to water. Some of those items are very water retentive, and others are there to create space and air and do not hold any water at all. So depending on how dry your room is in the environment that you're growing the orchid in is going to determine how you should best use the mix to suit your needs for how you're going to grow your orchid. So Phalaenopsis, they do require moist roots, but they should also be allowed to semi-dry between each watering. You don't want them bone dry to the point where all of your roots are going to start to shrivel, but you also don't want them kept constantly wet either. So what you're looking for is a balance somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. And that's not always going to be easy. Sometimes it does take a little trial and error. Now this is where things get a little bit more personalized when you're potting up your orchid. If your room is extremely dry, you're going to want a little bit more water retention than a room that's very humid and is kept at like 60 to 80% humidity. They're not going to need as much water retention in their pots. So there's where your balance on what you need to decide is going to be best is going to come from. My house is a bit dry. We have long cold winters. We use a lot of wood heat in our house, so my house gets very dry for half the year when the heat is on. So a bit of water retention in my potting media is going to be good for my orchids. So my blend consists of fir bark, sphagnum moss, perlite, and usually some charcoal chips. And that's what usually works really well for me. So just differentiate your ratios by what you're going to need for your environment. The more water retention you're going to need, the more sphagnum moss you can use, and probably water a little bit less often if it's going to hold a lot of moisture for you. So while our orchids require some airflow around their roots, they do need to have some moisture retention as well. So this is just where the delicate balance and the trial and error is going to come. Make sure you're just blending really well to get a good balance there, and whatever's going to suit your watering needs as well as the environment of your room. And I can do a video eventually on how I make my orchid blend so that you can see what I do. It's very easy. And then if you say, well, my orchids dry out really too fast, so I need a little bit more sphagnum moss, you can just make that adjustment in your own blend, and vice versa. If you need more aeration because your orchids are staying too wet, then you can just add more things that kind of break up through the sphagnum moss, causing air pockets. The fir bark, the perlite, the clay chips, those all make air pockets around the orchid's roots so that they can breathe and get that airflow that they require, so that they're not rotting and they're not in there just turning into black mush. Okay, so let's say you have your orchid, it's all potted up, everything's nice and balanced. How exactly do you water it? Some people like to put their entire pot right into a large bowl of water and let the orchid absorb water for a few minutes. That's what I do. And then you let it completely drain out. This is how I water it. I set it in a bowl, and once it's done soaking for like 3 minutes, I just put it on a towel, let it continue to drain before I put the orchids away again. You can water with a watering spout or a watering can and pour water into the pot itself, and then just let it all drain through. Just make sure you're getting all the media nice and wet, especially when you have a large pot like this. It's going to take more water than a small pot. Also, when you're watering an orchid this big, this pot is going to retain a lot more water for a longer period of time than a small pot is. So when you have a small orchid compared to a large orchid, usually that small orchid is going to dry out much faster than this large pot is. So sometimes you'll find that your smaller orchids need water more often than your larger orchids, just because their pots are drying out much more quickly because there's less media there hanging on to water. Now, because we're looking at a monopodial orchid with this central stem, there is like that central part of the orchid itself where everything is like holding on to the orchid itself. That's where all the vitality of the orchid is coming from that I mentioned in the beginning of the video. The roots, the leaves, the flowers are all coming out of the central heart of the plant. It's very important to take care of that part of the plant. So when you're watering, it's important to make sure all of these areas in the heart of the plant are remaining dry. So if you get all of this wet and water starts to collect between all of these leaves, all these little folds, all of these little cracks and crevices where water can get, if you let all of that sit there and build up and build up and build up, that can really cause some problems. And you can develop rot through the central part of your orchid, which is very detrimental to the plant itself. So stem rot is a #1 killer of Phalaenopsis orchids, because people just don't realize, they don't know that keeping all of this wet for too long is going to rot out your stem and kill your plant. So make sure all of that gets dry. I make sure my sunroom has airflow. I keep a fan running so that this part of the plant actually stays dry after watering. That's another reason I let them drain on a towel, and then I go in with a paper towel and I dry up all of these little cracks and crevices and just absorb any extra water, and I turn on a fan and I just keep the airflow on my plants going nice and fresh. Now, a lot of people might suggest watering your orchid with ice cubes. It is not something I recommend for different reasons. It is a marketing thing that a company kind of came up with to help stop things like stem rot and overwatering. But if you understand how to water your orchid anyway, you won't get stem rot if you watch what you're doing and you follow some good procedures. Watering with ice, one, it's just too cold for the plant. These are tropical plants. They don't like icy conditions. Two, it's not usually enough water, especially for a plant, an orchid in a pot this large. If I just threw some ice cubes in here, it's not going to soak up all this media, and I'll end up having to water more often than it's probably getting. Three, how am I feeding my orchid if I'm giving it ice? I fertilize my orchids every other feeding, and if I was just dumping ice cubes in here, how am I fertilizing it? I'm probably not. So ice just is out the door for me. It's not something I recommend. Again, if you want to try different techniques and see what works best for you, by all means, do what works best for you. It is just not something I'm going to recommend anyone doing. The other thing I don't recommend, and I did try, was water culture. This is where you take the orchid out of the pot, remove all the media, and you put it in a vase of water, and you let just the ends of all of the roots stay in a fresh vase of water. I tried it. My orchids did okay in it for about a year. They lost all of their roots, grew back new roots, which everyone says is normal. They have to reestablish, and the roots have to get used to being in water, and da-da-da-da-da. They did all that. But after they did all that, the new roots still didn't really become used to being in water. They still fought it. They still got too mushy. They still never liked it. They didn't flower very well. They just went downhill. And it didn't happen right away. Like right away, actually, I thought the orchids were doing better in the water culture. They had this point that they did have this time where they seemed to do great in it and loved it. And I went, oh, and it's so pretty to keep them in invasive water. But they just did eventually fail. And for me, water culture was a big fat no. And it wasn't just one orchid I tried it in. I tried several. I think I had about 12 different orchids going in water culture, including a few dendrobiums, and I think I even had an oncidium in there, and the rest of them were Phalaenopsis. It just was a no-go for me, so it's another thing I do not recommend you doing. But of course, experiment as you will. I did. I found out my own way why I don't like it and why it doesn't work for me. And of course, you can do the same. If you love it, continue doing it. Now, I do fertilize my orchids. I give them some different things. Sometimes I give them fish emulsion that I just add to the water and, you know, just water in as usual. I use the fish emulsion at a very light addition to my water. And I also use Orchid Food. I use a couple of different foods. I like to buy the liquid fertilizer from Hosserman's Orchids here in Chicago, and I give it a light dose of that every few feedings. I also buy the crystallized fertilizer from repotme.com. They have really wonderful fertilizers that have worked really well for me in the past. And my orchids, they're very healthy on both foods. So I like both foods. I recommend both foods, and I don't use anything else. Whatever you do buy, make sure it is a food made for orchids specifically, but also look on the back and double check and make sure the food does not contain urea. Urea cannot be processed by orchids, and it really just doesn't do them any good. So you'll find it in a lot of orchid foods, even though it's not good for them. So be aware of that and buy urea-free fertilizers. So how do we get our orchids to bloom again? That is another big #1 question. My orchids won't bloom. There are a couple things needed by the plant in order to be able to bloom again. One of them is enough layers of leaves. The plant does have to have time to have leaf growth and pay attention to leaf growth for a while. Usually this is during the summer months, at least for me, and not all orchids follow the exact same schedule. The one I'm actually holding is not one that loves to follow the same schedules all the time. This one actually loves to surprise me with a couple extra flower shoots during the year that I never expect. So this one just loves to grow, it loves to flower, and it doesn't follow a schedule, but most of my other Phalaenopsis do. So this is what I'm going to actually talk about is what most Phalaenopsis tend to do. You'll of course get individuals that follow a different schedule and some that bloom whenever the heck they feel like it, and that's just how it goes. But in general, a Phalaenopsis will require a few sets of leaves, usually at least 2 tiers of leaves, if not 3, to really send out a flower spike. They also require a drop in temperature to send out a flower spike. So usually this happens naturally in the fall when our temperatures are already decreasing for the season. And the cold nights will just spark your Phalaenopsis to start spiking, especially if it's healthy, it's been growing leaves. It's going to be all set for its flowering season to come along, and that drop in temperature is exactly what they need to set spikes. So what I end up doing is I bring all of my phales out into the sunroom if they're not already out here, usually come October when the night temperatures are really starting to drop, and I let it stay cool out here in the evening, like around the 50s. And that's usually enough to get all of my Phalaenopsis to kind of spark and start setting their spikes. Any phales that didn't do well during the summer for their time to grow leaves and roots and really focus on the plant, if they really didn't do well during the summer, I might not get a spike out of it. And that's okay. I usually expect that if they seem to have an off year of just having some good growth. So that can be expected. Overall, the health of the plant should be more of an important factor to you than getting flowers. Never choose flowers over the health of the plant. If your plant looks like it's struggling and it needs some time to rest, or it needs some time to grow leaves, and it's busy really trying to shoot off flowers, or you're really just not wanting to cut a flower spike because you really want those flowers, but your plant itself is struggling, that's a tactic you might want to begin to change. Take care of the mother plant before you worry about flowers. If it really needs time to work on leaf growth, root growth, or if it's been dehydrated and really needs to bounce back health-wise, forego your flowers for a while and take care of the plant. And next season, work on some beautiful flowers again. So that's all I really wanted to talk about today with the Phalaenopsis. There are so many different things we can really continue to go on about with these guys. I love my orchids. They're so fun to take care of, and they're so rewarding when they flower for you and they're doing well. They did take me some time. I was not good at Phalaenopsis orchids when I started with them. I had my share of killing orchids while I was learning how to keep them, and sometimes I still lose an orchid here and there. We're not perfect, we're learning all the time, and that's totally acceptable. I will talk in the future about how to repot your Phalaenopsis, how to make your potting mix, how to do your blends. We will go more into that on a separate video and do a repot with me, so I can walk you through how to actually do that, look through the health of your roots, all of it. There's so many other things that we can talk about with orchids. I can't fit it all into one video. So I just wanted to really do the basics here, talk about the physiology of the plant itself, how to do your basic care, but there will be more videos coming up. I'll do some walkthroughs on how I water, how I repot, how I take care of flower stems, anything like that. And if there's anything that you specifically want to see or want to know about orchids, shoot me a message down in the comments below. Let me know so I can include it in a video for you in the future. I love doing orchids. I can talk about them all day. And so with all of that said, I hope you guys have a wonderful day. If you enjoy gardening videos, home videos, anything that makes life at home better for you and more interesting and enjoyable, please subscribe to my channel for more future videos and hit like, please. It really does help me out. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Blessings. Bye.